Last night, Dr. Fauci appeared on CNN as part of a global town hall event on COVID. One viewer cited anecdotal evidence that the Omicron variant has caused mild disease and asked whether its spread could actually be a good thing.
There has been anecdotal information that some of the physicians, private physicians and others who see patients in South Africa are saying it's their impression that it is a less severe disease. But there are a lot of confounding issues there, Anderson, because the original outbreak was seen in a particular section and a particular area among younger individuals in Johannesburg and in other places in South Africa. So we really better not assume that. And it's always dangerous to say, let's get one infection really, really be spread so that it could protect you against another. You don't want to play around with SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonable response to the question, frankly. We all hope, of course, that this strain ends up being more mild. I think it is premature to say that it is. We're heartened by, that anecdotal evidence, but it's just anecdotes. And you don't want to, even if it was somehow true that, getting that probably does give you some immunity against a future threat. Again, I've had a breakthrough Delta infection. I'm hoping that gives me some immunity against, or plenty of immunity in addition to my vaccination against Omicron. But if more people get Omicron, then there could be an additional mutation that leads to some future more horrible strain. So that's not going to be, that will be a positive effect of Omicron if it's mild and not so deadly, but that's not something we can count on.
At some point, though, I think it's becoming more obvious to a lot of people that we're just going to have to live with COVID. And so obviously, if we're going to have to live with this thing, we want it to be as mild as possible, right? I mean, that's the hope. Now, with influenza, some years it's more severe than other years. And maybe COVID will be something that mutates around sort of like the flu. But my question is, at what point will we say, okay, we're just going to stop attempting to stop the spread? Because this attempt at stopping the spread is causing us to do all of these very radical things, and they're becoming more and more radical. I mean, in Australia, they now have camps that they're actually putting COVID positive people into in order to isolate them. And we saw China do this as well. And so, we're becoming a bit more radical in an attempt to stop the spread. And so at what point do we say, okay, this thing is mild enough that, we're just going to have to live with it. It's going to circulate around. You're going to get it. It's going to be hopefully like a cold. When are we going to get to that point, I think, is what a lot of people are wondering. And if Omicron is so mild that it doesn't even cause you to lose your sense of taste or smell, it gives you a little fatigue and a slight cough, at what point? So I think that's what people are wondering is maybe this is the point where we just say, let it go, I guess, and try not to catch it. Just like I try not to catch a cold. I try not to catch the flu. I don't want to be sick, right? But
yeah, well, Australia and Iceland are interesting kind of counterexamples in the sense that they're both islands. And, Australia in particular has this intense cultural pride in its ability to keep disease off the island. And because of that, has been shockingly willing to turn over an enormous number of civil liberties, in this effort to keep it contained. And, their number of cases over the entire pandemic is, probably
low.
Equivalent to what Toledo had yesterday.
Right.
And Iceland, I think, as an island too, has that same kind of cultural pride in being able to, keep things off the island. So,
but eventually it is going to spread on those islands, unless they stay locked down for the rest of Earth's time.
They're like, try me.
they're gonna outrun the heat death of the universe here. It's just eventually they will get COVID.
Right. Or there's two ways though that this ends. One is that you get a vaccine that actually stops the spread and actually suppresses and ends it, or it mutates into something that is mild. We don't know yet. We hope that Omicron is that thing, but like Fauci said, because it infected so many young people. That Delta could have affected those same number of young people and had the same mild effect. Yeah. So we'll see.
Dr. Fauci also talked about natural immunity, so let's take a look at that.
There's no doubt, Sanjay, that if you are infected with SARS-CoV-2 and you recover, that you're going to have a significant degree of protection. What we don't know, because it hasn't been studied as precisely as the post-vaccination immunological response, that we don't know what the durability of is, what the level of is. And you know, people who push back and say, well, wait a minute, are you saying that you don't get protection? No, you get a considerable degree of protection from getting infected and recovered. But the thing that we do know, that we're very sure of, that if you take an infected person who's recovered and then you vaccinate that person, that's the highest level of protection, both T cells, antibody, and all the immune parameters.
And here's what's obnoxious about that to me, Kim. I'm curious for your take. He's saying we haven't studied that a lot. Well, if only Dr. Fauci had some access to some type of resources, maybe a government agency, maybe a national institute that was in charge of studying health. That would be a useful thing for him to look into during a pandemic.
They're too busy torturing beagles and monkeys.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there actually have been several studies that have been done on this. The Israelis have come out with studies. There's been numerous studies actually showing that there is robust natural immunity and that less than 1% of the people who've been infected, truly infected. Now, I know people who claim they were infected twice with COVID, but when you really ask them the questions, it turns out the first time or even maybe the second time, they didn't actually test positive for COVID. They just had the clinical symptoms. And if you remember early on in the pandemic, and maybe even now, to be honest, I don't know exactly when they categorized someone COVID, but there was a period of time for sure when they were saying you either needed to test positive or exhibit these clinical symptoms and have the doctor or the hospital say that you had COVID. So some people say, well, I got it twice. And that is, you know, the study that actually the CDC came out with, there was a lot of scrutiny on it when they were saying, oh, no, people with natural immunity are not really that immune. And when you actually looked into the study, it was, well, did these people actually really have COVID? Who were the people that you were studying? I mean, there were a lot of questions surrounding that. And so there have been a number of studies showing but here's the thing. A lot of people do want to rely on natural immunity. They make the argument all the time, well, I have natural immunity, so I'm good to go. The fact is, you still don't know about that either. And that is just the truth. We don't know how long that lasts. Does it seem to be as effective as the vaccine? It seems to be, maybe more so in a lot of the studies. But for how long? We don't know. You know, I mean, again, I get the flu every, 3 years, right? So maybe this will be 3 years. Every 3 years you get COVID. I mean, there's a lot we just don't know.
And a significant explanation, I think, for why there's been so much study of vaccine, how effective the vaccines are compared to natural immunity. Well, who funds the vaccine research? The pharmaceutical companies. But who's the one profiting from natural immunity research? Nobody. That's why we need more public health investment in that type of thing. Dr. Fauci is in a position to make that argument.
Yeah, I was really skeptical much earlier in the pandemic when you were hearing about, reinfections, people are getting reinfected. And then it did turn out that almost none of those cases were correct. So maybe there were some people who had other health issues, and I think their bodies had trouble fighting off the infection, and maybe they technically still had COVID all the way through. They never, or the test in the middle to say they no longer had it was an error, or the first or the second or something. And it's still, I understand why now it's been so long. I guess it could be people who had maybe the original strain at the beginning. Possibly, I guess they could get Delta or Omicron. Mm-hmm. But you do not hear a lot of cases of genuine reinfection, and you hear tons of cases of breakthrough infections. I've had one. Right. So it's
LeBron has one now, right? Doesn't LeBron James? He's down and out with it.
Yeah, there you go. So I was glad to hear Dr. Fauci even acknowledge now that there is such a thing as natural immunity. But yeah, it's kind of rich. Well, we don't really know. We don't really know anything for sure. But it looks like you're pretty good to go. But you can get. But I agree. People should get both. I got both. But that's up to people to decide.
Maybe we should study.
Well, and also. One thing to know, too, with the studies that showed people with natural immunity and then when they got the vaccine, it did definitely show that they had a boost in the antibodies, but it was really, really slight. Yeah. And I mean, it was tiny. And it was just I suppose, but really it didn't seem like there was a huge need for it. But yes, technically it is correct that if you take it on top of having pre-infection, then you would get a little bit of a boost there. But again, we don't know for how long. And, there's a lot of questions on that. And I don't know if they've done a lot of studies on that, on what happens to a person who's been, like in your case, Robby, if you go and get a booster, Who's done a study on that? You've had 2 doses of the vaccine. You had the virus itself. What happens to somebody like you that gets a booster? Have they done a clinical study on that?
Yeah, they can do a clinical study on me if and when I decide to get it. I guess I'll donate my body to science. So it'll just be you two after I'm cut up by Dr. Frankenstein.
Right.
We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.